till the devil whispered behind the leaves. It's pretty, but is it art?
This is the greatest movie of all time. Oh, wait, that's not the right tape. This is the greatest film of all time.
Lights! Give me a mic. Thank you. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles. I'm speaking for the Mercury Theater, and what follows is supposed to advertise our first motion picture. Citizen Kane is the title, and we hope it can correctly be called a coming attraction.
At least according to critics and audiences and years of film scholarship and history and, well, you get it. It helped to pioneer a number of hugely influential filmmaking techniques and manages to feel fresh after almost 90 years. It's called Citizen Kane. Maybe you've heard of it. Probably not. It's an underrated gem. If you don't know, it lost the Sight and Sound title in 2012. There's a million things to find interesting about Citizen Kane. Perhaps the strangest part of the film is the story behind it. As many know, Kane was the debut feature of director Orson Welles, a longtime actor, radio host, and general personality. To be able to direct the so-called greatest film of all time on your first go is impressive enough, and at age 25, but even more so is the unmatched deal Welles got on the project. Because Welles was already established in the entertainment industry, and companies, especially RKO, had taken a liking to him, they offered Welles a 2-project film deal, with each having carte blanche, full artistic control over the final cut. They also allowed a budget nearly up to $500,000, not at all a modest amount, for both the features. It was such a scandalous turn of events that it remained the gossip of the industry and resentment of many within it for years going forward. Welles himself had a number of ideas for the film, supposedly even moving to create a first-person handheld adaptation of Heart of Darkness, a film that would undoubtedly also have been a pioneer. Eventually, after a parade of failed ideas, Welles teamed up with Herman Mankiewicz to begin work on what would eventually become Citizen Kane. Even examining this tumultuous, almost 3-year road to initial creation of the film, it becomes clear how different Kane is. Controversy still looms over the next part of the process concerning the script. Welles himself claimed, and I quote, "At the end, naturally, I was the one making the picture after all. Who had to make the decisions? I used what I wanted of Manx and, rightly or wrongly, kept what I liked of my own. Though this has long been disputed, perhaps most famously by critic Pauline Kael and by the recent film Mank, it's never really been settled where the script came from or from whom. It's undeniable that Mank was an integral part of the script, whether he is the ultimate big quotes artist or not. Most importantly, Mank personally knew and resented William Randolph Hearst, the real-life man who ended up forming the basis for the film's main character. This closeness could be a sign of his deep involvement in the script, but it could also point to Mank's contribution being less utilized by Welles in the final project, considering the kinder, more empathetic look the film takes towards the character of Kane. Even from before filming began, Citizen Kane was an innovation in the industry. But what makes this worth the title it has so long held? Well, the answer is that almost every aspect of the film continues this momentum of innovation. But perhaps the film's biggest contribution was its technical aspects of filmmaking. To say Kane was unique then and still is one of the strongest usage of light at ease ever. Perhaps the most famous innovation is the use of deep focus, brought to the film by cinematographer Greg Toland. Welles, who at the start of the film knew literally nothing about making movies, saw things very differently, and luckily he was assigned Greg Toland, who had shot some of John Ford and some of William Wyler's movies. Though Toland ended up leaving the film more or less about halfway through, together they invented this new grammar for filmmaking as a consequence of trying to save budget and Welles trying to imitate and evolve the style that he had seen in those John Ford films. Perhaps the most important of these was the use of deep focus. See, camera lenses have something called an aperture, which is how wide or narrow the blades of the lens open to allow light to hit the film or sensor. When the aperture is open, it gives a very shallow depth of field. This is the classic cinematic look. But when an aperture is closed, it gives a deep depth of field or deep focus. This means almost all the shot is in focus and allows scenes to play out at different increments, foreground, midground, and background. This was a favorite technique of filmmakers like Yasujiro Ozu. The most famous shot to do this from Kane is probably the negotiation for young Kane, which pins 3 interweaving stories at 3 different increments of the film level. Young Kane free in the back, his father resisting the contract in the midground, and his mother agreeing to sign him off to the bank in the foreground. Now let's see if we can recreate this effect. But deep focus was hardly the only strange innovation of these techniques. The film was also incredibly infamous for its use of low-angle shots, meant to give characters gravitas in a scene or make them feel more important. Larger than life, even, something very important to the characters of Kane. Welles famously dug out a hole to sit in order to achieve some of these angles. Let's see what we can do without digging a hole. There are also, of course, newsreel sections of the film, which were edited by RKO's actual news division in order to give them authenticity. Speaking of editing, Kane was edited by Robert Wise and Mark Robson, both prominent directors in their own right after the film's release. And the editing of the film was equally innovative, mostly because Welles and crew meticulously planned everything from the very start, making the post-production essentially a redundant process. Something important to note is that Kane was not a genesis, but a synthesis. It didn't invent any of these techniques it used, and some may argue it didn't even do them best. Rather, Kane's triumph was in its ability to fuse all of them together with an equally innovative way of telling a story, all under a single roof. Production of Kane went for around $100,000 over budget. Paired with the unconventional way of shooting and Welles' general attitude, RKO executives were tired of getting the runaround. This was paired with the outrage from Hearst in real life, Kane's inspiration and an incredibly influential man. Alongside the abysmal return of profits and the lapsing of Welles' contract, he was forced into losing the original creative control over his next picture. And it turns out this would be the start of his downfall. I want to talk about two Welles pictures in this video, but let's answer the question first. How is Kane the masterpiece that ruined his career? After all, it was his first film, and even upon release was lauded by many critics as one of the greatest films of all time. How can something so undeniably special be the nail in the coffin? Simple. Kane was too perfect for its time. The innovative use of techniques may have wowed critics, but they ultimately left most audiences cold and uninteresting, leading to a loss of money for RKO. Plus, Welles' general attitude toward the studio and movie-making style, which would often involve making fun of the studio execs when they came to visit, as well as a handful of other unconventional things, left a lot to be desired in the eyes of these executives. Such an early success no doubt hung over the rest of Welles' career, always trying to live up to the spectacle and brilliance of his first feature, but in a system that progressively trusted him less and less. The most interesting consequence of all was the slow transition Welles took into being a fully independent filmmaker, trying to escape from the Hollywood system, which originally trusted him and would go on to ruin each of his subsequent projects. 6 years after Kane and a string of films which had either been cut to pieces, as in the case of Magnificent Ambersons, or even been given meager budgets, which Welles had to work with, as in the case of, say, The Stranger, Welles left for Europe, where he would star and direct a handful of films over the next 10 years. He used his own money from projects such as The Third Man to finance Othello, the second Shakespeare adaptation he would direct. And the other film which saw him in the chair was Mr. Arkadin, financed by Welles' friend. After that stint in Europe, he would return to Hollywood with high hopes, starring in Touch of Evil, which eventually was upgraded as a directorial project for him, though it would continue the tradition of studios mangling the original version beyond repair. Although in the case of Touch of Evil, it would later see a restoration that tried to fix all these reshoots and re-edits by looking at Welles' original notes. After another disappointment, he returned to Europe to continue his act to finance film approach. This included The Trial and Chimes of Midnight. Both films Welles himself would deem as some of his best and/or favorites. He returned one more time to Hollywood in an attempt to continue his self-financing of films. This included, of course, F for Fake, and the long unfinished, unreleased, and believed to be lost final film of Welles, The Other Side of the Wind, our second stop in his career-ending masterpieces. The Other Side of the Wind was considered a lost film until 2018, when it was finally completed and released by Netflix alongside a documentary about its nearly 50-year production hell. Film is a perfect encapsulation of late-era Welles, blending the strange style of F for Fake with his various interests at the time, including examining and satirizing the movie business, which had long ruined his career, and shooting Oya Koder naked. The Other Side of the Wind, originally conceived and shot during the New Hollywood era, which means, as we've talked about before, a lot of avant-garde techniques were sneaking into semi-mainstream cinema, and the spirit of independent production continued to drive innovation forward after the French New Wave. The difference between Other Side and Kane is it never released at the time where it would have been truly innovative. And the only way it ended Welles' career is seeing the end of his life, not 10 years later. Even for the 70s, Other Side is weird, pioneering the documentary fiction mix of reality and meta-reflexiveness that would later return in F for Fake. It tells the story of Jake Hannaford, a John Hughes stand-in for Orson Welles, on the last day of his life as he tries to put together his final movie, an avant-garde pseudo-porno which producers keep pulling or rejecting funding from, and the birthday party he is throwing for the media storm. The whole film oscillates between styles to attempt to both maintain and destroy the verisimilitude its artifice creates. The film within a film, also named The Other Side of the Wind, is shot in a standard 16:9 ratio and features vibrant colors and what appears to be Italian or at least European cityscapes and vistas. The remainder of the film, the so-called documentary segments, switch constantly between the news cameras recording the incidents, meaning a switch in grain reel quality from color to black and white, and a continuous fury of mad cuts, never letting a shot play out in a long or wide. A stark change from the original vision of Citizen Kane. All of this, both by necessity and likely Welles's own demand, his attempt to connect with the younger burgeoning generation, as is exposed by Jake Haverford's own desire in the film, reflect the hyper-independent status of the film. Like similar projects of the time, think the independent Wanda, it had to be shot quick and dirty, with loads of shaky cam and constant cuts to use the best takes regardless of the angles or framing this might suggest. It is a movie fastened together by necessity. This goes for the music also. A non-stop jazzy score plays over the whole thing to keep the energy up and match the editing, but also to add the hallucinatory and even suffocating tone the film is trying to engineer. Stylistically, it may be the furthest from Kane we've seen Welles go, but thematically it actually shares a lot of common ground. Both films, perhaps following in Carlyle's footsteps, examine great men and the hubris which allows for their downfall. In the case of Kane, this is revealed through the people in his life, but in Other Side, those people are reduced to side characters, and instead the focus is wholly on the news media, people Welles would have been all too familiar with. And this thematic similarity should not be surprising. It's fairly likely Welles saw himself as this great man, whose slow downfall was predicted by a world that was constantly against him. Welles never finished Other Side, at least not in his lifetime. The shooting continued throughout the 70s and were followed by money issues and legal trouble, which permanently shelved the film. There would be no Hollywood comeback. Halfway into the 80s, still occasionally working on the film and editing or leaving notes, he would die. It would then sit dormant for 30 plus years, constantly trying to resurface or become complete, until Netflix and Peter Bogdanovich would throw together a cut based on the notes and buy the rights, finally releasing the film into the world. Did Other Side ruin Welles's career again? Or was the shadow of Kane still haunting over the production? Even in my brief description and analysis of the film, I couldn't help but compare it to Kane, and I'm sure that's something producers and critics would have done for the film as well, just as they had for every film Welles had done subsequently. It's a rare occurrence to ruin your career on your first outing, let alone doing it by making one of the greatest films of all time. But then again, Welles was a rare kind of man. Thank you for watching. Next time, we're going to turn our attention to one half of The Archers and examine the mirror to Hitchcock's Psycho with Michael Powell and the 1960 film, which ruined his career, Peeping Tom. Join me then. I hope you enjoyed. Remember, you can kill the artist, but you'll never kill the art.